welcome back to the channel, the only place on the internet where we peel back the scenic veneer of the American wilderness to reveal the terrifying breathing darkness that lives just beneath the surface. I am your host, and today we are not just telling ghost stories around a campfire. We are diving headfirst into the shadowy, palpitating heart of America's most infamous hiking route, the Appalachian Trail, a 2,000-mile vein of ancient mountains where people go to find themselves, but where far too many end up losing their minds, or worse, vanishing into thin air. Before we step onto the trail, if you are new here and you have an appetite for the strange, the terrifying, and the unexplained phenomena that plague our national parks, make sure you smash that subscribe button and ring the notification bell right now, because the stories we are about to uncover are the kind that will make you rethink your next camping trip, and you do not want to miss a single second of this documentation. Let's begin with a harrowing account from a man we will call Marcus, a veteran of the backcountry who thought he had seen everything the wild had to offer until the mountains of Tennessee showed him something that defied every law of nature he understood. Marcus wasn't a novice. He had spent over 15 years conquering everything from the high deserts of the Pacific Crest to the rugged spine of the Continental Divide, building a mental fortress of rationality and survival skills that he believed made him untouchable. But nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, could have prepared him for the auditory nightmare that was waiting for him in the deep, isolated woods near the North Carolina border in October of 2019. He was undertaking a solo section hike, capitalizing on a stretch of perfect autumn weather where the air was crisp enough to snap in your lungs and the foliage was burning with those brilliant reds and golds that photographers travel thousands of miles to capture. The first 48 hours of his trek were the definition of idyllic, offering moderately challenging terrain and the kind of solitude that heals the soul, with only the occasional friendly nod from a passing hiker to break the silence. However, on the third day, the trail offered him a choice that would change his life forever. His map, a detailed topographical print he had relied on for years, showed a faint, barely maintained side trail that promised a detour to a series of limestone caves, marked with a handwritten notation claiming they were worth the extra miles. Feeling strong and having time to spare, Marcus made the fatal decision to veer off the beaten path. The side trail was immediately hostile, a narrow, overgrown scar in the forest where rhododendron thickets and brambles clawed at his pack as if trying to hold him back. After 2 grueling miles of pushing through the dense underbrush, the oppressive canopy finally broke, revealing a jagged, rocky outcropping where the earth seemed to have opened its mouth in a silent scream. There, carved into the gray hillside, were the dark, gaping maws of at least a dozen caves, none of them large, perhaps 6 feet high, but their sheer number gave the landscape a porous, diseased look, like a honeycomb made of stone. He approached the nearest entrance, the air temperature dropping noticeably as he stepped into the shadow of the rock face, pulling out his headlamp to peer into the gloom. The entrance was draped in ancient vines and thick velvet moss, giving it a forgotten, primordial quality that made him hesitate. And it was in that moment of hesitation, standing on the threshold of the subterranean world, that the sound began. It didn't start like a normal noise. It bled into his awareness, a faint, rhythmic vibration that seemed to be carried on a wind that wasn't blowing. It was singing, unmistakable, melodic singing. It sounded like female voices, a choir of maybe 3 or 4 distinct tones, harmonizing in a way that was simultaneously hauntingly beautiful and profoundly, sickeningly wrong. The melody was alien, drifting somewhere between an old Appalachian hymn and a discordant folk song, but the structure of it was impossible to pin down, sliding between notes in a way that Western music simply doesn't do. And the most terrifying part. Marcus's rational brain immediately tried to categorize the threat, assuming that perhaps a group of hikers or local spelunkers had set up camp inside to take advantage of the natural acoustics. But as he listened closer, the hair on his arms stood up in a primal reaction to a predator. The sound was too perfect, too mathematically synchronized, possessing a resonance and a reverb that human vocal cords are biologically incapable of producing. It felt less like sound waves and more like a physical pressure pushing against his eardrums. Fighting the urge to flee, he called out, "Hello, is anyone in there?" The reaction was instantaneous and terrifying. The singing didn't just fade out, it was severed, stopping abruptly as if a tape had been cut. The silence that followed was heavy, almost pressurized, creating a vacuum where no birds sang, no squirrels chattered, and even the wind seemed to die, leaving him in a bubble of dead air. Then the footsteps began, not from the single cave he was facing, but from all of them. From every dark opening along the ridge, the sound of slow, deliberate movement on stone echoed out. It was a coordinated march, step, pause, step, pause. The rhythm was mechanical, a hive mind movement that suggested whatever was in those caves was moving in perfect unison toward the light. Marcus didn't wait to see the faces of the choir. A surge of adrenaline, hot and metallic, flooded his system, overriding his curiosity with pure animalistic terror. He spun on his heel and sprinted back down that overgrown trail, ignoring the branches that whipped his face and the brambles that tore at his clothes. Behind him, the singing erupted again, but the tone had shifted violently. It was no longer beautiful. It was angry, a cacophony of discordant screeches and clashing harmonies that physically hurt his ears, sounding less like voices and more like the grinding of tectonic plates given a voice. He ran until his vision blurred, until his lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass, bursting back onto the main trail and collapsing only when the normal, comforting sounds of the forest, the birds, the wind returned to his senses. But the true horror, the detail that keeps Marcus awake at night years later, came when he returned to civilization. When he examined his map in the safety of his home, looking for that side trail, he found nothing. No notation, no line. He even visited the local ranger station to ask about limestone caves in that specific sector, and the ranger looked at him with a mix of confusion and pity, explaining that the geology of that area was completely wrong for cave systems and that no such formations existed on any survey map. Yet Marcus knows what he saw, and more importantly, he knows what he heard. Sometimes, in the dead of night, he wakes up sweating, the phantom echo of that impossible, non-human melody drifting through his mind, a siren song from a place that doesn't exist on any map. He has vowed never to return to that section of the trail, and frankly, I don't blame him. If you have made it this far into the video, you are clearly one of us, a seeker of the truth no matter how dark it gets. But before we unveil the next nightmare, I have a mission for you. We are striving to build this community to 1,000 dedicated subscribers here on Park Ranger Files, and every single subscription is a weapon against the obscurity these stories face. So, if you want to keep these investigations alive, hit that subscribe button right now. And while you're at it, drop a comment below. Have you ever heard music in the woods where no music should be? I read every single comment, and your story might just be the subject of our next deep dive. Now, let's shift our focus to a different kind of horror. One that is less about what you hear and more about what you see or what you wish you hadn't seen. The second account comes from a woman named Jennifer, a resilient hiker who was attempting a through hike of the Appalachian Trail in the spring of 2006. She was traveling with a close friend and hiking partner named Melissa, and the two of them had found a comfortable, steady rhythm after 3 weeks on the trail. Jennifer's written account paints a picture of tranquility. They would wake with the dawn, hike until the early afternoon, and spend the evenings decompressing, not chasing speed records but soaking in the experience. One particular night in Virginia, they set up camp near an established shelter that was already overflowing with other hikers. It was a social evening, sharing freeze-dried meals and stories with a couple from Vermont and a solo hiker, creating a false sense of security that numbers often provide in the wilderness. Because the shelter was full, Jennifer and Melissa pitched their tents about 50 yards away in a flat, small clearing, close enough to feel safe but far enough to have privacy. Around midnight, the illusion of safety was shattered. Jennifer woke to the sound of footsteps crunching on the dry leaves nearby. At first, she dismissed it as a fellow hiker heading to the privy, a common occurrence, but as her sleep-fogged brain processed the sound, she realized something was wrong. The cadence was too fast, almost a jogging pace, and it was getting closer with unnerving speed. Unzipping the rainfly of her tent just an inch, she peered out into the moonlit woods, and what she saw defied every logical explanation her brain tried to offer. There was a figure moving along the trail, but it wasn't walking in a way that biology allows. It was moving in a strange, staccato, jerky manner, like a digital video that is buffering or skipping frames. 1 second, the figure would be 20 feet away, and in the literal blink of an eye, it would be 10 feet closer, without any visual evidence of the movement in between. It was as if the entity was teleporting in microbursts, or as if Jennifer's brain was simply refusing to process the creature's locomotion. The figure was vaguely humanoid but deeply distorted, too tall, impossibly thin, with limbs that seemed to possess too many joints or bent at sickening, acute angles that would snap a human bone. It was dressed in an approximation of hiking gear, pants, boots, a backpack, but the clothes looked like a costume, ill-fitting and draped over a frame that didn't understand human anatomy. As it glitched closer, its head turned, scanning the campsite with a mechanical predatory rotation when it finally faced Jennifer's direction. The true horror hit her like a physical blow. Where a face should have been, eyes, nose, mouth, there was nothing. Not a mask, not a shadow, but a void. It was a complete absence of features. a smooth, blurred darkness as if someone had taken an eraser to reality itself and scrubbed out the identity of this thing. The entity stopped directly between Jennifer's tent and Melissa's, standing perfectly still, its head slowly rotating like a security camera seeking a target. Jennifer lay frozen, her breath caught in her throat, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she feared the sound alone would give her away. Then, the creature did something that still haunts her nightmares to this day. It didn't bend at the waist, it leaned. Its spine seemed to possess the flexibility of rubber, elongating and curving unnaturally as it pressed that featureless, void-like face right up against the nylon fabric of Melissa's tent. Jennifer watched in paralyzed horror as the fabric indented, the outline of the creature's face pressing in, invading the sanctuary of her sleeping friend, hovering there for 30 agonizing seconds of silence. It was tasting the air. It was listening. Then, just as abruptly as it had arrived, it snapped back to a standing position and continued down the trail in that same impossible frame-skipping motion, vanishing into the darkness within seconds. Jennifer did not sleep again that night. She sat upright, gripping her hiking knife until her knuckles turned white, waiting for the sun to banish the monsters. At first light, she scrambled to Melissa's tent, terrified of what she might find, but Melissa was asleep, completely unaware that a faceless abomination had been inches from her head. When Jennifer recounted the story over breakfast, Melissa believed her. The sheer terror in Jennifer's eyes was undeniable. But the other hikers at the shelter had seen nothing. They considered leaving the trail right there, abandoning months of planning, but they decided to push on, adopting a strict rule to only camp in the center of crowded areas. They finished their hike without seeing the glitching figure again, but the story doesn't end there. 2 months after returning to her normal life, Jennifer was scrolling through an online forum for hikers seeking closure when she found a post from 2011, 5 years prior to her encounter. The user described seeing the exact same thing. A jerky, impossibly tall figure with no face, moving like a skipping videotape along the trail at midnight in the exact same section of Virginia. In the comments of that post, 3 other independent witnesses corroborated the story, all claiming to have seen the glitch man in that specific corridor of woods. Whatever that thing is, it is not a hallucination, and it is not a myth. It is out there right now, walking the trail in the dark, looking for something or someone, and we can only pray it never finds what it is searching for. Our final descent into darkness takes us to the trail's notorious Rocksylvania section, a story passed down from an older gentleman named Robert, who spent his summers as a volunteer trail maintainer in Pennsylvania during the 1990s. Robert has since passed away, but his daughter felt this story needed to be told, a warning from the grave. In the sweltering summer of 1997, Robert was responsible for a 15-mile stretch of the trail, performing the unglamorous but essential work of clearing fallen timber and marking paths. He was a man of the woods, comfortable in isolation, but there was one specific spot on his beat that always made his skin crawl. It was a sharp 90-degree bend in the trail that hooked around a massive, ancient oak tree. This wasn't just any tree, it was a leviathan easily 300 years old, with a trunk so colossal that 3 grown men couldn't link arms around it. Its bark was gnarled and black, and the area surrounding it felt fundamentally wrong. The temperature would plummet 10 degrees the moment you stepped into its shadow, and the silence was absolute. No birds nested in its branches, no squirrels scurried around its roots, not even the buzzing of flies could be heard. It was a dead zone. Hikers frequently reported the sensation of being watched intensely as they passed it. One humid August afternoon, Robert was making his rounds when he discovered a young hiker sitting at the base of the oak. The man looked to be in his early 20s, equipped with expensive gear, but his condition was shocking. His clothes were shredded, caked in mud, and his face was a map of scratches and bruises. But it was his eyes that scared Robert. They were wide, wild, and filled with a desperation that bordered on madness. Robert approached, asking if he needed water or medical aid. The hiker looked up, staring through Robert rather than at him, and whispered, "I can't leave. It won't let me leave." Confused, Robert asked what he meant. The story the boy told was impossible. He claimed he had stepped off the trail 3 days ago to relieve himself and had simply lost the path. He had wandered for hours, eventually finding this tree. But every time he tried to hike away from the tree, walking in a straight line in any direction, he would inevitably, inexplicably find himself standing back at the base of the oak within 30 minutes. He was trapped in a spatial loop tethered to this ancient entity. Robert, a practical man who knew every inch of these woods, assured the kid he was just turned around and promised to lead him out personally. They started walking together, Robert carefully marking their path. But here is where reality fractures. After 20 minutes of hiking, Robert turned around to check on the boy, and he was gone, vanished. The trail was narrow, there was nowhere to hide, no sound of running, just empty space where a human being had been seconds before. Robert shouted, searched, and eventually ran to the nearest shelter, assuming the boy had bolted ahead. He wasn't there. A massive search and rescue operation was launched, but no trace of the hiker was ever found. No equipment, no footprints, nothing. But the horror didn't stop there. A week later, Robert returned to the oak tree, dread pooling in his stomach. Scratched into the bark, fresh enough that amber sap was oozing like blood from the wound, was a message. The tree takes one every 7 years. It took me. Don't make a trade. Robert reported it, but it was dismissed as a macabre prank. Obsessed, he went to the library archives and began digging into missing person reports for that county. He found the pattern. Every 7 years, like clockwork, 1947, 1954, 1961, 1968, 1975, 1982, 1989, 1996, a hiker would vanish in that exact vicinity. Experienced, well-equipped people simply erased from existence, but the most disturbing detail he uncovered concerned the missing hiker from 1989. His body had eventually been found 8 years later, in 1997, sitting at the base of that oak tree. The coroner's report was baffling. Despite being missing for 8 years, the body showed signs of having been dead for only a few hours. No decomposition, no weathering. It was as if he had been held in stasis, or in a place where time didn't move, before being discarded by the tree. Robert quit his volunteer position that day. He tracked the news from a distance, watching the pattern hold. 2004, 2011, 2018. In each of these years, a hiker disappeared near that section of the trail, their cases eventually going cold. And now, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Do the math. The last disappearance was in 2018. We are approaching the summer of 2018-5. The 7-year cycle is closing. That tree is hungry, it is patient, and it is waiting for its next trade. If you are planning to hike in Pennsylvania next year, I beg you, stay on the path. Do not stop at the big oak. And if you hear footsteps that echo a little too perfectly, or see a figure that glitches in the moonlight, run. Just run. Because the woods are lovely, dark, and deep, but they have promises to keep, and they are always, always watching. Listen closely, because the advice I am about to give you isn't just folklore. It is a survival directive written in blood and fear by those who learned the hard way that the woods are not always what they seem. If you find yourself hiking deep in the heart of central Pennsylvania, navigating the twisting spines of the ancient ridges, and you come across a massive, gnarled oak tree standing like a sentinel where the trail takes a sharp, unnatural bend, do not stop to admire it. Do not rest against its bark. And for the love of everything holy, do not make a trade, do not leave an offering, and do not acknowledge the silence that falls over the forest. Just keep walking, eyes forward, heart steel, until the birds start singing again. The Appalachian Trail is beautiful, yes, but it is also a corridor of high strangeness, a jagged scar running through the oldest mountains on Earth, and sometimes the veil between our world and something much darker wears thin. This is story 4, a terrifying account from a hiker named Thomas who stared into that abyss in 2018 while attempting a section hike through the rugged wilderness of North Carolina, a place where the trees grow thick and the shadows stretch long before the sun even sets. Thomas wants it on the record that he was not some hapless amateur wandering into the woods without a clue. He had been meticulously planning his Appalachian Trail section hike for months, studying topographical maps, weighing his gear down to the ounce, and mentally preparing for the isolation. He wasn't a novice, having completed plenty of backpacking trips in state parks and national forests before, but this was his first time on the granddaddy of them all. He admits now that he was excited, fueled by adrenaline and perhaps a dangerous amount of overconfidence, the kind that nature loves to punish. His itinerary was set to take him from the rustic charm of Hot Springs, North Carolina, all the way to Irwin, Tennessee, a 5-day journey through some of the most breathtaking and physically punishing terrain on the East Coast. It is a beautiful section, renowned for its bald mountains and sweeping vistas, but it demands respect with its crushing elevation changes. Thomas had plotted out every single stopping point, memorizing the locations of the 3-walled shelters and the backcountry campsites, packing everything he needed to survive. Day 3, however, was when the reality of the trail shifted into a nightmare. He had been making excellent time, his trail legs finally kicking in, moving faster than he had anticipated, and he reached his target shelter around 4 in the afternoon. The sun was still high above the tree line, casting dappled golden light through the canopy, giving him plenty of daylight to push further if he wanted. But the fatigue was setting in, a heavy ache in his bones, so he decided to settle in early, enjoy the luxury of a hot meal while the sun was still up, and get a solid night of restorative sleep. The shelter was completely empty when he arrived, which didn't strike him as unusual for a random Wednesday in late September, when the summer crowds had thinned out and the thru-hikers were mostly north. It looked like a standard-issue Appalachian trail shelter, a rustic three-sided wooden structure with an overhanging roof, a raised wooden sleeping platform to keep hikers off the cold ground, and a stone fire pit situated out front, filled with the charred remnants of previous travelers' fires. There was even the ubiquitous trail register book, a weather-beaten notebook tucked into a plastic bag, which he dutifully signed with his trail name and the date, cementing his presence in that place and time. He set up his sleeping bag on the hard wooden platform, cooked a simple dinner on his camp stove, and sat watching the sunset paint the sky in bruising purples and fiery oranges. Everything seemed perfectly, blissfully normal. As the twilight faded into the heavy, suffocating darkness of the deep woods, he climbed into his sleeping bag, zipped it up tight against the chill, and dozed off into a dreamless exhaustion. He woke up abruptly around midnight, pulled from sleep not by a scream, but by the sound of voices. It was a muffled conversation, a low, rhythmic hum of people talking quietly, deliberately keeping their voices down so as not to disturb other sleepers. Thomas's groggy mind immediately rationalized the situation. He figured a group of night hikers had arrived late, pushing through the dark to make miles, and were now settling in, trying to be considerate. He didn't bother opening his eyes, just rolled over and tried to drift back to sleep, waiting for them to settle down. But the voices didn't stop. They kept talking, a continuous droning murmur that seemed to lack any pauses for breath or thought. After about 10 minutes of lying there in the dark, listening, Thomas realized something that made the hair on his arm stand up. He couldn't make out a single actual word. It wasn't that they were whispering too quietly, it was that the sounds weren't words at all. It was pure vocal inflection without language, a mimicking of human cadence, like listening to a conversation in a fever dream where you understand the emotional weight but comprehend absolutely none of the syntax. It was a hollow, empty sound. He opened his eyes, and the adrenaline dump was immediate and painful. The shelter, which had been empty hours before, was now full of people. At least a dozen figures were crowded onto the sleeping platform with him, but they were all facing away from him, staring toward the back wall. They were all engaged in that soundless, wordless conversation, a buzzing hive of non-speech. As his eyes adjusted to the gloom, he realized their attire was wrong, completely wrong. They weren't wearing modern synthetic fabrics, puffy down jackets, or using ultralight gear. They were dressed in old-fashioned hiking clothes, heavy wool flannel shirts, canvas rucksacks with external frames, sturdy leather boots, the kind of gear you would see in a faded Kodachrome slide from the 1950s or 60s. Thomas tried to sit up to ask who they were, but he found he was paralyzed. It wasn't sleep paralysis. He knew the difference. He was fully awake, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, but his body simply refused to obey his commands, locked in a primal freeze response. All he could do was watch in terror as these figures continued their silent conference. Then, with terrifying precision, they stopped. The humming ceased. One by one, slowly and stiffly, they turned to face him. The horror that washed over Thomas in that moment is indescribable, because where their faces should have been, there was nothing but smooth, pale skin. No eyes to see him, no noses to smell him, no mouths to speak that droning language. Just blank, fleshy expanses that somehow, impossibly, conveyed that they were looking directly at him, scrutinizing his very soul. They stood there for a heartbeat that felt like an eternity, and then, in perfect synchronization, they all stood up. They didn't walk toward the open front of the shelter to leave. They turned and began walking toward the solid wooden back wall, and they didn't stop. They walked right through the wood as if it were made of smoke, disappearing one after another into the night, dissolving into the grain of the timber until Thomas was alone again in the silence. The moment the last canvas-clad figure vanished, the paralysis broke. Thomas didn't think, he reacted. He grabbed his gear, didn't even bother rolling up his sleeping bag, just stuffed it violently into his pack, his hand shaking so badly he could barely work the zippers, and he ran. He clicked on his headlamp and fled into the night, risking injury as he scrambled over roots and rocks, hiking through the pitch-black terror until he saw the gray light of dawn and reached the next shelter miles down the trail. There were 2 other hikers there, waking up to their morning coffee, and Thomas must have looked like absolute hell because they immediately rushed over to ask if he was injured. He spilled the whole story, the voices, the faceless men, the gear, everything. They exchanged glances that clearly said they thought he was having a breakdown or hallucinating from exhaustion. But then, one of them, an older gentleman with weathered skin who had been hiking the ad on and off for 40 years, asked Thomas to describe the shelter he had stayed in. Thomas gave him the details, the specific shape of the roof, the stone placement of the fire pit, the location of the trail register. The older man's face went pale, draining of all color. He reached into his pack, pulled out a smartphone, and scrolled through a digital archive of historical trail photos he kept. He showed Thomas a black and white picture. "Is this it?" he asked. It was the exact shelter, but the photo was dated 1983. According to the veteran, that specific shelter had been torn down and burned in 1985 after it became structurally unsound and infested. The new shelter, the one that actually existed in reality, was built a quarter-mile down the trail from the old site. Thomas had somehow spent the night in a ghost structure, a shelter that hadn't existed for over 30 years. The worst part came later that day when, seeking closure and sanity, Thomas convinced the other hikers to walk back with him to show them where he had been. When they arrived at the coordinates, there was nothing there. Just empty forest, undisturbed undergrowth, and silence. No foundation, no fire pit, no trail register. The only thing that proved Thomas hadn't hallucinated the entire ordeal was his sleeping bag. He had left it behind in his panic during the initial scramble. They found it lying in a pile of dead, rotting leaves, hovering in the air slightly atop the brush, exactly where the sleeping platform of the old shelter would have been. Thomas finished his section hike because he refused to let the fear win, but he never slept in a shelter again. He pitched his tent, always ensuring he was near other living, breathing humans. Because if you can spend a night in a building that doesn't exist, surrounded by the faceless echoes of hikers who walked the trail decades ago, what other laws of reality don't apply out there in the dark? But ghosts of the past are one thing, predators of the present are entirely another, and sometimes the things watching you from the woods are flesh and blood, and they are hungry. This brings us to story 5, a harrowing account from a solo female hiker named Amanda who experienced a terrifying stalking incident in 2020 that shattered her sense of safety forever. Amanda needs you to understand one thing before she begins. She is not someone who scares easily. She is a seasoned veteran of the outdoors, a woman who has traveled alone through remote areas all over the world, navigated foreign cities, and trekked through desolate wilderness. She knows how to take care of herself. She carries bear spray, a fixed blade knife, and has taken extensive self-defense classes. She thought she was prepared for anything the Appalachian Trail could throw at her. She was wrong. In October 2020, Amanda was embarking on a week-long solo hike through one of the most remote and rugged sections of the Appalachian Mountains, the famed 100-mile wilderness region where civilization feels like a distant memory. The weather was picture perfect, with crisp autumn air and foliage exploding in reds and golds, and the trails were blissfully quiet since it was late in the season. She was in hiker heaven. On her third day, she stopped at a lean-to shelter for a quick lunch break. There was only one other person there, a man, likely in his 50s, wearing filthy mismatched clothes and carrying an old, battered external frame backpack that looked like it had been dragged through mud. He didn't say a word when she arrived. He just watched her. It wasn't a casual glance. It was an intense, predatory stare that made her skin crawl immediately. Amanda had encountered weirdos on the trail before. Is a term of endearment, but this was different. She gave him a polite, curt nod, kept her distance, and ate her energy bar quickly, her hand hovering near her pack straps. The whole time, the man didn't blink. He didn't eat, didn't drink water, didn't check his map. He just stared at her with eyes that seemed devoid of any social contract. When she finished, she packed up and headed back to the trail, eager to put miles between them. She looked back once and saw him standing at the shelter entrance, still watching her walk away. She picked up her pace, hiking hard to create a gap. Here is where the nightmare began. About an hour later, Amanda stopped to take a photo of a stunning valley view. As she was lining up the shot on her phone, she caught movement in her peripheral vision. It was him, the man from the shelter. He was maybe 50 yards behind her on the trail, moving at the exact same pace she was. At first, she tried to rationalize it. The is a linear trail, a green tunnel, everyone is going the same way. But her gut instinct, that ancient alarm system we all have, was screaming. She decided to test him. She stopped, pretending to adjust her bootlaces, and waited for him to pass. He didn't. He stopped about 30 yards away, partially obscuring himself behind a large hemlock tree, and just stood there, watching. Her heart began to race, a cold sweat breaking out on her back. She got up and continued hiking, moving significantly faster now. Every time she glanced back over her shoulder, he was there, maintaining that precise distance, never sprinting to catch up, but never falling behind. He was tethered to her. She tried everything to break the dynamic. She stopped abruptly and turned around, shouting, "Do you need help?" hoping to shame him or get a verbal response. He didn't respond. He stood motionless on the trail like a statue. She took a long break at a water source. He waited in the brush. She even tried trail running, jogging with a full pack, but he somehow kept pace without seeming to exert himself, gliding over the roots and rocks. This cat-and-mouse game went on for hours. The sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, menacing shadows, and Amanda was genuinely terrified. She was in a remote section with zero cell service, miles from the nearest logging road, and this silent predator had been hunting her all afternoon. She made a desperate decision. She knew of a blue-blazed side trail coming up that led to a remote, rarely used tent site. It wasn't on her planned route, but she hoped she could lose him in the labyrinth of the woods. She took the turnoff, hiking furiously to the site, which was thankfully empty. She set up her tent in record time, camouflaging it behind a dense thicket of spruce trees so it wouldn't be visible from the main path. She didn't build a fire. She didn't cook. She crawled inside, fully clothed with her boots on, clutching her bear spray in one hand and her knife in the other, and she waited in the suffocating darkness. Around 9:30 p.m., the sound she had been dreading drifted through the nylon walls. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, crunching footsteps pressing into the dry leaves. They didn't walk past the site. They circled her tent. Once, twice, 3 times, a predatory orbit. Then, silence. The footsteps stopped right outside her tent door, inches from her face, separated only by a thin layer of fabric. She could hear breathing, heavy, wet, raspy breathing like lungs full of fluid. And then a voice spoke. It sounded wrong, rough and grinding, as if the vocal cords had never been used for speech before, like gravel grinding against glass. She gripped the bear spray trigger until her knuckles turned white. "You can't hide from me," the voice rasped. "I can smell you. I've been smelling you all day." Her stomach churned with nausea. This wasn't just a creep, this felt like something feral. The footsteps started again, but the cadence had changed. They weren't walking in a circle anymore. They were pacing back and forth in front of the door, but the rhythm was uneven. Step, step, pause. Step, step, pause. It sounded like someone walking on 2 legs, but not quite understanding the mechanics of human movement. Then came the scratching. Long, slow, deliberate scratches against the rainfly of her tent. It didn't sound like fingernails. It sounded like bone, or claws, or something harder and sharper. The sound sent jagged chills down her spine. "Come out!" the voice hissed. "I just want to see you up close. I want to smell you up close." That was the breaking point. Amanda screamed. She screamed at the top of her lungs, a feral roar of terror and rage. She yelled that she had a gun, that she had called the police via satellite, that help was coming, all lies. But she was desperate. The scratching stopped instantly. The footsteps retreated, crunching away into the darkness, faster this time, and then absolute silence. Amanda didn't sleep for a second. She sat rigid, listening to the wind, waiting for the monster to return. When the first gray light of dawn broke, she packed her tent in a frenzy and practically sprinted back to the main trail. She hiked 20 miles that day without stopping, fueled by pure adrenaline, until she reached a road crossing where she flagged down a passing car and begged for a ride to the nearest town. She was done. She reported the incident to the local sheriff and the trail authorities, giving them a detailed description of the man, but they never found anyone matching it. They checked the trail register at the shelter where she had first seen him. There was no entry for that day except hers. The ranger she spoke to, however, told her something that made her blood run cold. He said that over the last decade, there had been sporadic reports of hikers, specifically solo women, being followed by a man matching that exact description. The pattern was always the same: the silent staring, the pursuit at a distance, the circling of the tent at night, the mimicry of speech. But here is the terrifying part. No one had ever actually seen the follower in broad daylight after the initial encounter. It was always just the victim's word. "If I were you," the ranger said, his voice low, "I'd count myself lucky. Not everyone who gets followed by that thing makes it out to tell the story." Amanda hasn't stepped foot on the Appalachian Trail since. She probably never will, because she knows now that there are things out there that hunt, that follow, and that wait for you to be alone. And if you are unlucky enough to catch their attention, the woods are vast, and there is nowhere to hide. Sometimes the danger doesn't come from a stranger. Sometimes it wears the face of the person you trust most in the world. This final, deeply unsettling account was shared by a man named Kevin, who experienced a reality-shattering event while hiking with his brother in 2015. Kevin wants to emphasize the bond he shares with his brother Ryan. They have been hiking partners since they were Boy Scouts. They know each other's habits, quirks, walking rhythms, and nonverbal cues so well that they can practically predict what the other is going to do before they do it. That deep familiarity is exactly what made the events of 2015 so absolutely terrifying. They were undertaking a 3-day section hike through a less-traveled, rugged part of the in Georgia, where the trail winds through dense rhododendron tunnels and steep gaps. It was early spring, the air was still biting cold at night, and they had the trail mostly to themselves. It was supposed to be a standard brotherly bonding trip. The first day was textbook 10 miles covered, camp set up, freeze-dried meals eaten, and sleep by hiker midnight. Day 2 began just as smoothly. They were making excellent time, the weather held, and morale was high. Around midday, they reached a scenic overlook, a rocky outcropping offering a view of the rolling Blue Mountains. They stopped for lunch. Ryan mentioned he needed to use the bathroom and headed off into the woods to find some privacy, following the leave no trace protocol of going 200 feet away from the trail. Kevin stayed at the overlook, eating his sandwich and soaking in the view. After about 5 minutes, Ryan emerged from the tree line and sat down next to Kevin. "Nice view," Ryan said, pulling out his own lunch bag. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes, watching a hawk circle the thermals. Then Ryan spoke up. "I'm thinking we should push on to the next shelter instead of stopping at the planned one. Make tomorrow a shorter day. What do you think?" Intuing his food. "Sounds fine to me. Let's do it." They finished their lunch, packed up their trash, and stood up to adjust their packs. As Kevin was buckling his hip belt, a voice called out from the woods behind them, from the exact direction Ryan had gone to use the bathroom. "Kevin, you still there?" It was Ryan's voice, unmistakably Ryan's voice. Kevin's blood froze in his veins. He felt a sensation like cold water being poured down his spine because Ryan was standing right next to him, adjusting his trekking poles. Kevin turned to look at the person next to him, the person he had just eaten lunch with, and saw that he was staring back toward the woods with an expression of bizarre, vacant confusion. "Kevin." The voice from the woods called again, sounding slightly closer. "Where'd you go, man?" The Ryan standing next to Kevin grabbed his arm. His grip was incredibly strong, painful even. "What the hell is going on?" The Ryan next to him whispered. Then the bushes parted, and Ryan, the real Ryan, or at least another version of him, emerged from the woods, buckling his belt. When he looked up and saw Kevin standing next to himself, his face went sheet white, the color drained out of him instantly. "Kevin, get away from that thing," the new Ryan shouted, his voice shaking with a terror that felt incredibly genuine. "That's not me. I just walked up." Kevin looked at the person next to him. It looked exactly like Ryan. The same scruffy beard, the same blue windbreaker, the same mud stain on the left knee of his hiking pants. But now that Kevin was really looking, under the duress of absolute horror, he could see tiny microscopic differences. The eyes were slightly too far apart, giving the face a subtle, fish-like quality. The smile didn't quite reach the eyes. The muscles around the mouth were engaged. But the rest of the face was dead. The posture was too rigid, too perfect, like a mannequin posed to look like a hiker. "Kevin," the duplicate standing next to him said, and the voice sounded wrong now. It had a digital metallic distortion to it, like a recording played at slightly the wrong speed. "Don't listen to that thing. I'm your brother. That's something trying to trick you." Kevin looked between them, his heart pounding so hard his vision was blurring. Two identical Ryans, both claiming to be the real one, both looking at him with desperation. The duplicate took a step toward him. "Come on, Kevin, let's just go." The movement was fluid, too fluid, like oil sliding downhill. The Ryan by the woods stood his ground, gripping a heavy rock he had picked up. "Kevin, think," and then Kevin remembered. When they were kids, terrified of home invaders after watching a horror movie, they had made up a code word for emergencies, a nonsensical phrase that only the two of them knew, a password for their own brotherhood, to be used if they were ever separated or in danger. Kevin took a step back, putting distance between himself and both figures. He looked at the Ryan standing next to him, the one whose eyes were just a little too wide. "If you're Ryan," Kevin said, his voice trembling, "what's the code?" The smile didn't waver, but the eyes went completely dead. "We don't need games, Kevin. Let's just go." Kevin turned to the Ryan by the woods. "What's the code?" The Ryan by the woods didn't hesitate. Tears were welling in his eyes. "Blue monkey dishwasher," he screamed. Kevin didn't wait. He swung his trekking pole with all his might at the duplicate standing next to him. The tip connected with the duplicate's shoulder, but it didn't feel like hitting bone and muscle. It felt like hitting a bag of wet sand. The duplicate didn't scream. It just let out a hiss, a sound like high-pressure steam escaping a vent, and its face rippled. For a second, the feature slid off, revealing a gray, wet blankness underneath. Kevin and the real Ryan ran. They sprinted down that trail like demons were nipping at their heels, leaving the thing hissing and twitching on the overlook. They didn't stop for the shelter. They hiked through the night, fueled by a terror so profound it overrode their physical limits, until they reached a main road and called for extraction. They don't hike that section anymore. In fact, they don't hike deep woods at all, because they know that somewhere out there, something is walking around wearing a face that doesn't belong to it, waiting for another pair of brothers to stop for lunch. It was a dumb kid thing, a trivial inside joke we'd kept alive over the years to annoy our girlfriends, but in that freezing, silent stretch of the deep woods, it became the only lifeline I had left. "What's the word?" I asked, staring directly into the eyes of the man standing 5 feet away from me, the man who looked exactly like my best friend Ryan. The real Ryan, the one standing to my left, didn't hesitate. He immediately snapped back with the correct code word, a nonsensical phrase we'd coined back in high school. I won't repeat it here. That combination of syllables is the only thing keeping us alive, and it's staying strictly between us. But the moment the sound left his lips, I knew. The air shifted. The duplicate, the thing wearing my best friend's face like a stolen mask, realized the charade was over. Its expression didn't change the way a human's would. There was no sudden realization or flash of anger. Instead, the facade simply dissolved. The fake smile dropped, not into a frown, but into a slack, hollow emptiness that suggested there was absolutely nothing behind those eyes. The features started to shift, losing their structural integrity, the skin rippling like oil on water. The nose flattened, the eyes drifted apart, and the jawline softened, becoming less defined, resembling a sculpture of wet clay left out in the rain, slowly melting into a featureless slab of flesh. It didn't scream, it didn't attack. It simply turned its back on us and walked into the dense underbrush, moving not with a normal human gait, but with that same terrifyingly rigid, frictionless glide we had noticed earlier, too perfect, too smooth, like a marionette being pulled by invisible strings. Ryan and I didn't exchange a single word. We didn't need to. The primal instinct to survive overrode every other thought in our brains. We grabbed our packs, knuckles white, and got the hell out of there, moving with a speed that bordered on panic. We hiked for the rest of that day without a single break, ignoring the burning in our lungs and the blisters forming on our heels, covering nearly 15 miles of treacherous terrain before we felt even remotely safe enough to stop. Even then, safe was a relative term. We made camp in a clearing with clear sightlines, but neither of us slept. We sat back to back, shivering not just from the cold but from the adrenaline crash, taking turns keeping watch over the darkness pressing in against our tent. The worst part came the next morning, in the gray, washed-out light of dawn. As we were packing up to leave, desperate to reach civilization, I found them, footprints circling our campsite. 2 distinct sets. One set belonged to Ryan's boots. I recognized the specific Vibram tread pattern instantly. The other set was identical. Same size, same wear pattern, same weight distribution. The duplicate hadn't just walked away, it had followed us. It had stood just outside the thin nylon of our tent all night long, silent and patient, watching us, listening to our breathing, waiting for a slip-up, waiting for an opportunity to finish the replacement it had started. We finished that hike on pure adrenaline, but we have never ever gone back to that section of the trail. To this day, whenever we hike together, even on crowded paths in broad daylight, we constantly verify each other's identities with that code word. Because if something out there could duplicate Ryan that perfectly, down to the scar on his chin and the tone of his voice, what's to stop it from trying again? What's to stop it from succeeding next time and walking out of the woods in his place? Sometimes, late at night, I lie awake and wonder if the duplicate is still out there, pacing that remote section of the trail, waiting for the next set of hikers to pass through. Is it watching them right now, learning their mannerisms, memorizing their voices, preparing to become them? And the most chilling thought of all, how many hikers have come across their own duplicates without realizing it until it was too late? How many people have walked into the woods with a friend and walked out with something else entirely? These stories just keep getting more disturbing, don't they? We still have 4 more harrowing accounts to cover, each one darker than the last. But first, I want to take a brief second to remind you that Park Ranger Files relies entirely on your support to keep unearthing these documented accounts of wilderness horror. We are agonizingly close to hitting that 1,000 subscriber milestone, and hitting that button truly makes a massive difference in our ability to produce this content. Plus, by subscribing, you ensure you're notified the second we upload a new nightmare. I also want to engage with you directly. What would you actually do if you turned a corner on a trail and saw a duplicate of yourself or your hiking partner? Would you run? Would you fight? Drop your strategy in the comments below. I read every single one. Now, let's descend back into the darkness with our next terrifying account. Story number 7, The Cabin. This incredibly detailed narrative comes from a group of college students who survived a reality-bending experience during spring break in 2017. The following account was painstakingly compiled from separate interviews with all 3 survivors, ensuring the details align. Sarah, Mike, and Christina were juniors at a university in Maryland, looking for an escape from the pressures of exams. They decided to spend their spring break hiking a secluded portion of the Appalachian Trail, cutting through the rugged wilderness of West Virginia. They weren't expert survivalists, but they weren't novices either. They had done their research, purchased high-quality gear, and felt confident they could handle a standard 4-day loop. On their second night, the weather turned on them with a violence they hadn't anticipated. A severe thunderstorm rolled in around 7:00 p.m., dropping the temperature and turning the sky a bruised purple. The planned shelter was still 3 grueling miles away, and the rain began to fall in sheets, coming down so hard it blurred the world into a gray wash, making it nearly impossible to spot the white blazes on the trees. Lightning began to strike the ridges around them, close enough that they could physically feel the static charge raising the hair on their arms, the thunder cracking like artillery fire directly overhead. That's when Christina spotted it through a break in the trees, a structure. It wasn't a standard 3-walled trail shelter, but an actual cabin, complete with glass windows, a solid oak door, and a stone chimney rising into the storm. It wasn't marked on any of their topographic maps, nor was it listed in their guidebooks, but in that desperate moment, geography didn't matter. Survival did. They needed to get out of the lightning, and they needed to do it now. They approached the cabin cautiously, boots squelching in the mud. It looked old, timeless even, but remarkably well maintained. There was a covered porch that offered immediate relief from the deluge, and split firewood was stacked with military precision beside the door. No lights burned inside, and there were no vehicles or signs of recent habitation, just the overwhelming sound of rain hammering the roof. Mike stepped up and knocked firmly on the door, shouting over the thunder to see if anyone was home. Silence. He tried the handle, twisting the brass knob. It turned smoothly, unlocked. They pushed the door open, creaking slightly, and called out again, still nothing but the echo of their own voices. After a brief shivering debate about the ethics of breaking and entering, they decided the emergency conditions justified the intrusion. They agreed to leave a polite note explaining their presence and would happily leave cash to compensate the owner for the firewood and shelter. Stepping inside, the atmosphere shifted instantly. The interior was surprisingly, almost unnervingly, cozy. The main room featured a large stone fireplace, a compact kitchen area, 2 bedrooms, and a bathroom. The furniture was antique, heavy wood and floral fabrics, but spotless. Books lined the shelves, black and white photographs hung in orderly rows on the walls, and there were even ceramic dishes stacked in the kitchen cabinets. It looked like someone's beloved home, just temporarily empty, as if the family had stepped out for a walk moments before the storm hit. They built a roaring fire in the hearth, the dry wood catching easily, and the warmth began to chase the chill from their bones. They stripped off their soaked layers, dried their clothes by the fire, and heated up freeze. Dried meals, the smell of food and wood smoke creating a false sense of security. As the storm raged impotently outside, battering the windows, they actually started to laugh, feeling an immense gratitude for their incredible luck in finding this hidden sanctuary. They wandered the room, examining the framed photographs on the wall, snapshots of a family from what looked like the 1960s and 70s. A husband and wife smiling on the porch, children playing in the yard, holiday gatherings around a turkey, normal, happy life documented in fading Kodachrome. Around 10:00 p.m., exhausted from the hike and the stress of the storm, and lulled by the hypnotic crackle of the fire, they decided to turn in. Sarah took one of the bedrooms, while Mike and Christina, who were a couple, took the other. The plan was simple: sleep hard, wake up at first light, and hike to the nearest ranger station to report the cabin's location and their unauthorized use of it. Sarah, buried under thick quilts, fell asleep almost immediately, but the peace didn't last. Around 2:30 a.m., she was pulled from a deep sleep by a sound that didn't belong: humming. A woman's voice, low and melodic, humming a tune Sarah didn't recognize. It was coming from the main room. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. She sat up, listening. The humming continued, mournful and repetitive. She crept out of bed and cracked her bedroom door open, peering into the main living area. The fire had died down to glowing embers, casting long, dancing shadows across the floor. In the dim red glow, she saw a figure sitting in the rocking chair by the hearth. An elderly woman in a long, white nightgown, rocking slowly back and forth, the rhythm of the chair matching the rhythm of the humming. "Hello," Sarah called out softly, her voice trembling, terrified of startling the stranger. "I'm so sorry. We took shelter here because of the storm. We didn't mean to intrude." The rocking stopped, the humming cut off abruptly. The woman turned her head slowly toward Sarah, but the angle of the dying fire left her face completely shrouded in shadow. "That's all right, dear," the woman said. Her voice was dry, crackling like autumn leaves, heavy with an impossible age. "I don't get many visitors anymore. Most people can't find this place." Sarah let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. Relief washed over her. The owner was here, she was real, and she seemed understanding. Sarah stepped fully into the room, apologizing profusely again and explaining the severity of the weather. "Oh, I know about the storm," the woman interrupted, her tone flat. "I died in a storm just like this one." The air in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees in a second. Sarah froze. "Back in 1972, the woman continued, as if reciting a grocery list, lightning struck the white oak outside. Sent a branch right through that window there." She raised a withered hand, pointing a crooked finger across the room. Sarah's eyes involuntarily followed the gesture and saw that one of the window panes was indeed newer than the others, the glass less wavy, the frame recently repaired. Sarah's blood turned to ice in her veins. She must have misheard. Her brain tried to reject the information. I'm sorry. What did you say?" "I died here," the woman repeated, louder this time, her head still turned, face still hidden in the dark. "Husband died 10 years before that. Kids moved away to the city. I was all alone when it happened. Took 3 days for the neighbors to find my body. 3 days in the cold." Sarah wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at her to turn, to scream, to wake up Mike and Christina and dive through a window. But she was paralyzed, rooted to the floorboards, unable to tear her gaze away from the shadowy figure in the chair. "You shouldn't have come here," the woman whispered, and now the sadness in her voice was replaced by something else, something jagged and angry. "This is my home, mine. You don't belong here." The woman stood up abruptly, the chair rocking violently behind her. She stepped forward into the glow of the embers, and Sarah finally saw her face. It was a nightmare made flesh. The woman's face was rotted, in a state of advanced decay. Strips of gray, leathery flesh hung loosely from the cheekbones, revealing the yellowed skull beneath. One eye socket was completely empty, a black void, while the other held a milky, clouded eye that fixed on Sarah with a hatred that was almost physical in its intensity. Sarah finally found her voice. She screamed, a sound of pure, primal terror that echoed through the cabin. She spun around and bolted for Mike and Christina's room, pounding on the wood with both fists. "Wake up! Wake up! We have to go!" Mike and Christina emerged, groggy and confused, blinking in the darkness. "What? What is it?" "There's someone here. We have to leave right now." Sarah didn't wait for them to understand. She grabbed her pack. The sheer panic in her voice galvanized them. They grabbed their still damp gear, shoving feet into boots, and ran for the front door. Sarah risked one terrified glance back toward the fireplace. The figure was standing in the center of the room, watching them. But she wasn't alone anymore. In the flickering, dying light, Sarah saw other figures emerging from the shadows. A man standing stiffly in the corner, his jaw hanging at an unnatural angle. Children sitting on the floor, their skin mottled in gray. All of them bore the same signs of decay. All of them watched the intruders with expressions of profound rage and resentment. The students burst out of the cabin and into the night. The storm had passed, leaving the forest dripping and cold, illuminated by a bright, indifferent moon. They ran down the trail, slipping on mud, tripping over roots, not caring about the darkness or the risk of injury. They just needed to put distance between themselves and that house of the dead. They hiked through the entire night, fueled by terror, refusing to stop until they reached the designated trail shelter at dawn, miles away. Other hikers were waking up, boiling water for coffee, and they looked at the trio as if they were insane. The students were pale, shaking, covered in mud, with eyes wide and haunted. The next day, they hiked straight to a local ranger station to report the experience. They gave a detailed, hysterical account of the cabin's location, the furniture, the specific family photos they'd seen on the walls. The ranger, an older man with decades of experience, listened patiently, his brow furrowing. When they finished, he sighed and pulled out a large topographic map. "There's no cabin in that sector," he said quietly. There was one, back in the 60s and 70s, belonged to the Miller family. But it burned to the ground in 1972. Lightning strike during a massive storm. The students went silent. A woman died in the fire, the ranger continued, looking up at them. Trapped inside, her family never rebuilt. The stone foundation is still there, buried in briars if you know where to look, but that's it. The structure has been gone for 45 years. He walked over to a filing cabinet and pulled out a folder of historical archives. He slid a photograph across the desk. It was a black and white picture of the cabin they had slept in, the same porch, the same windows, and in the foreground the same family, the husband, the children, and the woman Sarah had seen sitting in the rocking chair. They had spent the night in a memory. They had taken shelter in a ghost. They had warmed themselves by a fire that hadn't burned since the Nixon administration, and slept in beds that had turned to ash decades before they were even born. None of them ever returned to the trail. Sarah transferred to a university on the West Coast the following year, desperate to put as much distance between herself and West Virginia as possible. Mike and Christina's relationship disintegrated shortly after. They couldn't look at each other without remembering the rotting face in the firelight. But the most disturbing detail, according to Sarah, is that the horror didn't stay in the woods. Sometimes, late at night in her apartment, when the silence is heavy, she still hears it, that humming. She hears that old woman's dry, crackling voice humming that unfamiliar tune from the corner of her room. And she knows, with a terrifying certainty, that somewhere out there in the wilderness, in a cabin that doesn't exist, that angry spirit is still waiting, rocking in the dark, waiting for the next group of lost hikers to knock on her door. We are venturing into some truly disturbing territory here, folks. But before we continue into the abyss, I need to take a moment to ask for your help. Researching and creating these deep dive videos takes an immense amount of time and energy, and the absolute best way you can support this channel is by subscribing to Park Ranger Files. We are on a critical mission to hit 1,000 subscribers, and we are counting on you to help us cross that finish line. Also, this community is built on your experiences. If you have your own unexplained, creepy, or downright terrifying encounters from the Appalachian Trail or any other wilderness area, please share them in the comments below. Your story could be the centerpiece of our next episode. Now, let's get back to these chilling accounts. My Story NE4, ADS, of it taking counts. This next narrative comes from a highly experienced hiker named David, a man who prided himself on his logic and preparedness until a disorienting experience in 2019 shattered his reality. This occurred while he was hiking solo through the Green Mountains of Vermont. Here is David's statement in his own words. "I've hiked extensively throughout the Appalachian Range for 20 years. I pride myself on my navigation skills. I'm not one of those day hikers who relies on a smartphone battery. I can read a topographic map and use a magnetic compass. I know how to identify ridgelines and landmarks. I rarely get lost. That confidence almost killed me. I was undertaking a solo week-long hike through Vermont in late September 2019. It's usually a beautiful time of year up there. The leaf peepers haven't fully arrived yet, the air is crisp, and the trails are relatively quiet. I was following the long trail where it overlaps with the At, heading northbound. On day 4, everything was normal. I reached a known trail junction where, according to my map, the path split. The long trail continued north, while the At split off toward the east. My plan was to stay on the long trail, so I took the northbound fork without a second thought. The sun was high, visibility was perfect. After about 30 minutes of steady hiking, I came to another junction. This immediately struck me as odd because my map indicated a straight shot for at least 5 miles. But there it was, a fork in the road, and not just a fork. The trail split 3 ways, northeast and west. There were no wooden signs, no colored blazes painted on the trees, nothing to indicate which way led where. Just 3 identical paths cutting into the dense fir trees. I pulled out my compass and map, trying to triangulate my position. According to my calculations, there shouldn't be a 3-way junction here. It didn't exist. But here I was, standing in the dirt, looking at 3 clearly defined trails. I assumed I had somehow drifted off course, so I decided to backtrack. The logical move is always to return to the last known good point. I turned around and hiked back the way I came, but after hiking south for 15 minutes, which should have taken me back to the original split, I came to another junction. A new one, and it wasn't the one I had left. This was a 4-way crossroad. North, south, east, west. Again, no signs, no blazes, and it definitely wasn't on my map. A cold prickle of fear started at the base of my neck. Okay, I told myself, forcing a calm I didn't feel. GPS systems fail, maps get outdated, trails get rerouted, don't panic. I decided to pick a cardinal direction south and follow it, until I hit a road or a landmark I recognized. I checked my compass, verified south, and started walking. I hiked hard for an hour. By my pace count, I should have crossed a logging road that intersected the mountain. Instead, the trees thinned, and I stepped into a clearing with yet another junction. My stomach dropped. This one had 7 different trails branching off in all directions, radiating out like spokes on a twisted wheel. Now, I was genuinely terrified. I've been hiking the Appalachian for 2 decades, and I have never seen a trail system designed like this. It was chaotic, nonsensical. It felt like a glitch in a video game. I tried calling for help. I pulled out my cell phone, no service. That wasn't unusual for the area, but it added to the isolation. I grabbed my emergency whistle and blew 3 sharp, ear-piercing blasts. The universal distress signal. The sound died instantly in the trees. No echo, no response, just a suffocating silence. I was completely, utterly alone. I refused to give up. I picked another trail at random, but this time I took precautions. I used a piece of traveler's chalk I kept in my kit to mark a large X on the trees at the entrance of the path, ensuring I would know if I was going in circles. I hiked for 2 hours, checking my compass every 100 yards. I was moving in a straight line. I was sure of it. And then the trees opened up, and I found myself back at a junction. I looked at the trees. There, staring back at me, were my chalk marks. I had looped back to the 7-way junction. It was physically impossible. I had walked in a straight line for miles, yet I had arrived back at the start. That's when the reality of the situation hit me. I might die out here. The geometry of the woods was wrong. Space wasn't working the way it was supposed to. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in blood-red hues, I made a decision. Wandering in the dark was a death sentence. I would set up camp right there, in the center of the junction, wait for daylight, and try to signal for help with a mirror or fire. Maybe a ranger patrol would come by. Maybe the morning sun would reveal a landmark I had missed. I pitched my tent on the hard-packed earth, forced myself to eat some jerky, and tried to calm my racing thoughts. I was rationing my water now, acutely aware that I might be stuck here for days. As true darkness fell, the woods became pitch black. I climbed into my sleeping bag, gripping my hiking knife, and tried to rest. Sleep was impossible. Around midnight, I woke up to voices, not animal sounds, not the wind voices, human voices. It sounded like a crowd, a cocktail party happening in the middle of the wilderness. Multiple people talking all at once, a cacophony of whispers, but I couldn't distinguish a single word. It was just a murmur of speech, unintelligible and flat. The sound was surrounding me, drifting in from all 7 of the trail branches simultaneously. I unzipped my tent slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, and pewed out into the night. What I saw made me question my sanity. Down each of the 7 trails, standing about 50 yards away in the darkness, was a figure holding a lantern. 7 identical figures. They were silhouetted against the glow of old-fashioned oil lanterns, the light sickly and yellow. They stood perfectly motionless, guarding the entrance to their respective paths. "Hello," I called out, my voice cracking. "Can you help me? I'm lost." The reaction was instantaneous and synchronized. All 7 figures raised their free hand and beckoned to me. A slow, curling motion of the finger. "Come here." They did it in perfect unison, like a single organism, or like I was watching the same person reflected in 7 mirrors. I didn't move. Every alarm bell in my primate brain was ringing. This wasn't a rescue party. This was a trap. Something about the way they moved, too fluid, too synchronized, was profoundly wrong. And then they took a step forward. All 7 of them, stepping toward my tent at the exact same moment. These were not rescuers coming to save me. They were something else entirely, something that had crawled out of the deepest, darkest recesses of the Appalachian nightmare. They said it in unison, their voices overlapping into a discordant, grinding chorus that sounded like dry leaves skittering over bone. Follow, 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 follow. The word didn't just vibrate in the air. It echoed from all 7 directions simultaneously. a surround sound hallucination that built in volume until the pressure against my eardrums was physically painful, a shrill frequency that tasted like copper in the back of my throat. I jammed the palms of my hands against my ears, squeezing until my head throbbed, but the sound ignored the barrier. It seemed to originate from the center of my own skull, bypassing the ears entirely to burrow directly into the brainstem. Follow. I squeezed my eyes shut, tears leaking out from the sheer sonic pressure, and I screamed into the void, begging, pleading for them to stop, for the forest to return to the natural order of things. The silence that followed was not gradual. It was absolute and immediate, like a heavy steel door slamming shut on a riot. When I finally summoned the courage to peel my eyes open, the woods were empty. The flickering lights were extinguished. The trails were barren. There was only the moonlight filtering through the canopy, casting long, skeletal shadows that seemed to reach for my tent. I didn't sleep for a single second the rest of that night. I sat cross-legged in the center of my tent, my knuckles white as I gripped my survival knife, staring at the nylon door zipper, waiting for it to move, waiting for dawn to break the spell. When the sun finally bled a pale gray light into the forest, I packed my gear with frantic, trembling hands and made a decision that likely saved my life. I was done trying to navigate the labyrinth. I was done trusting the trails that seemed to shift like snakes in the underbrush. I was going to pick one cardinal direction and walk until my legs gave out or I hit civilization. I set my compass due south. I wasn't going to deviate. I wasn't going to turn for a river or a cliff or a promising-looking path. I was going to become a human bulldozer. I started walking, ignoring every junction that tried to seduce me away from my bearing. It was brutal, punishing work. I pushed through brambles that tore at my clothes and skin, scrambled over rotting deadfalls teeming with insects, and waded through mud that tried to suck the boots off my feet. It was exhausting, slow-going, and terrifying, but I was committed to the geometry of survival. After 6 hours of hellish bushwhacking, the trees suddenly broke. I stumbled out onto asphalt, a beautiful, cracked, paved road with yellow lines and the smell of exhaust. I flagged down the first vehicle I saw. A battered pickup truck driven by a local farmer with skin like weathered leather. He let me in, and as the heater blasted my frozen hands, I told him where I had been. He didn't interrupt, but his eyes in the rearview mirror went cold. "That area has got a reputation," he said, his voice graveled with years of tobacco and silence. "Locals don't go hiking there, son. Too many people get lost, even the ones who grew up in these woods. Some say the geography ain't fixed. They say the trails move around, twisting back on themselves to lead you in circles until you starve." He paused, shifting gears. "My grandfather used to call them fairy roads, paths that exist in the seam between this world and another. He said if you step onto one of those paths, you aren't walking on God's earth anymore. You're walking somewhere else. And if you follow them deep enough, you end up in a place where the map doesn't matter." I never did figure out exactly what happened to me out there, but the obsession didn't leave me when I returned to the city. I've scoured high-resolution satellite imagery of that specific sector of the forest, analyzing every pixel. There is no network of trails. There is no complex maze. It's just dense, unbroken canopy and one single trail cutting straight through. I've gone back twice since then, always in the safety of high noon, always with a group of other hikers. I've tried to find that first junction where reality seemed to split. It's not there. The trail just goes straight through, boring and linear. No junctions, no split paths, nothing but trees and dirt. But I know what I experienced was real. I have the digital timestamps on my GP's unit proving I was lost in a 2-mile radius for nearly 18 hours. I have the photos on my phone of trail markers that don't exist on any ranger map. And I still have the nightmares. I wake up sweating, hearing that chorus of voices, seeing those 7 figures with their antique lanterns beckoning me to step off the path and follow them into the dark. Whatever lives in those woods, whatever intelligence creates those impossible trails to lure the confident and the arrogant, it is still there. It is waiting for the next hiker who trusts their compass a little too much. So, if you are hiking in the deep woods of Vermont and you come to a fork in the road that isn't on your map, do not take it. Do not let curiosity kill you. Turn around. Run. Because some paths don't lead to a destination, they lead to a place where the rules of physics are merely suggestions, and where the things watching you from the trees are hungry for company. And whatever you do, never, ever follow the lanterns. But sometimes the horror isn't in what you see with your eyes, but what the camera sees when you aren't looking. This next account comes from a woman named Rachel, a story that exposes the terrifying gap between human perception and mechanical reality. Rachel is an amateur photographer, the kind of meticulous artist who chases the perfect lighting like a drug. In May of 2021, she planned the ultimate solo trip, a 3-day excursion through a secluded section of the Appalachian Trail in New York. She wasn't just there for the cardio, she was packing serious glass, a high-end seer, multiple lenses, a carbon fiber tripod, the whole professional rig. She wanted to capture the raw, untamed beauty of the East Coast wilderness for her portfolio. For the first 2 days, the trip was a dream. The weather was crisp, the sky was a piercing blue, and the isolation felt liberating rather than lonely. She was capturing award-winning shots, feeling that flow state that every artist craves. On the second evening, she found herself at a breathtaking overlook just as the sun began to dip below the horizon. It was the golden hour, that magical window of time where the light turns to liquid gold and shadows stretch out like long, dark fingers. The scene was perfect, rolling mountains fading into a purple haze, framed by ancient pines. She set up her tripod, locked the focus, and began shooting a burst series. She took nearly 20 photos of the exact same composition over the course of 10 minutes, adjusting the exposure and aperture slightly with each click to ensure she got the perfect image. At the time, looking through the viewfinder, she saw nothing but nature. Just trees, rocks, and the fading light. It was peaceful, it was silent, it was perfect. She hiked out the next day, feeling triumphant. It wasn't until 3 days later, in the safety of her apartment, that the safety was shattered. She uploaded the raw files to her computer, a massive 27-inch monitor illuminating the room. She began the editing process, scrolling through the Sunset Overlook series. That's when she stopped. Her hand froze on the mouse. In one of the photos, just one, there was something in the background that made no sense. Standing in the tree line, partially obscured by the deep shadows of a hemlock tree, was a figure. It was definitely humanoid, standing upright, but it shouldn't have been there. She had been alone. She was sure of it. But the camera doesn't lie. Or does it? She quickly toggled to the previous photo. The spot was empty. She toggled to the next photo. Empty again. She checked the timestamps. The photos were taken seconds apart. 7:13 p.m. Empty. 7:13 p.m. The figure. 7:15 p.m. Empty. It was as if the entity had flickered into existence for a single second, just long enough to be caught by the shutter, before vanishing back into the ether. Rachel leaned in, her heart hammering against her ribs, and zoomed in. As the pixels expanded, the dread in her stomach turned to ice. The figure was humanoid, yes, but the proportions were grotesque. The limbs were too long, like wax that had been stretched. The head was bulbous and slightly too large for the neck. And despite being several hundred yards away, buried in the brush, it was facing the camera, directly at her. She tried to rationalize it. Pareidolia, the mind's trick of seeing faces in leaves, a trick of the light, a passing hiker moving incredibly fast. But the feeling of being watched, even now, through the computer screen, was overwhelming. Seeking answers, she posted the raw file to a niche hiking forum, asking if anyone had experienced similar anomalies on the @ She expected ridicule. She expected skeptics to tear it apart. Instead, she got a deluge of terror. The thread exploded. Dozens of hikers responded, not with theories, but with their own photos. The images were from all over Virginia in 2015, Pennsylvania in 2018, Maine in 2018. Different states, different years, different seasons. But the figure was identical. The same elongated limbs, the same bulbous head, the same stillness. It was always in the background, always in the tree line, and always in just one single frame of a burst. The professional photographer chimed in, claiming he had seen the figure in 3 separate shoots over a decade. He had even reported it to the rangers as a potential stalker, but no footprints were ever found. It was a ghost in the machine. But the true horror lay in the details. Rachel, against her better judgment, decided to run the image through specialized enhancement software, pulling detail out of the shadows. As the noise cleared and the face sharpened, she recoiled from her desk, knocking her coffee over. The thing didn't have a face. Not really. Where the features should have been, it was covered in eyes. Dozens of them. Different sizes, different colors, all blinking independently, all looking in different directions, except for a cluster in the center that stared right down the lens. And below the eyes, a mouth. That whispered and it was but it wasn't a smile of joy. It was a mimicry, a distortion of lips that looked like a jagged wound, as if something alien had seen a human smile once and was trying to replicate it without understanding the anatomy. She deleted the enhanced file immediately, scrubbing the trash bin, but the image was burned into her cortex. The story gets worse. She received a private message from a user who had captured the figure in 2009. He told her that after he noticed the figure in his hiking photos, he started seeing it elsewhere. First, in the background of a family barbecue photo, then in the grainy footage of his Ring doorbell camera, then in the reflection of a window in a selfie. He said it was getting closer. In the woods, it was hundreds of yards away. At his house, it was at the property line. In the mirror, it was standing right behind him. He sent her one final message 3 months ago. He attached a photo taken that morning in his bathroom mirror. In the reflection, peering over his shoulder, was the figure. It was so close that its breath would have fogged the glass. He said he was going to turn around and confront it. He was going to catch it. That was the last time anyone heard from him. His accounts went dark. His phone was disconnected. Rachel hasn't picked up a camera since. She realized that a camera is not just a recording device. It might be a summoning device. By observing the observer, by capturing the image of something that exists between the seconds, she might have invited it in. Now, she warns everyone, when you take a photo in the woods, do not look too closely at the background. Do not search the shadows, because if you find it, it knows you found it. And once it knows you can see it, it starts getting closer. The final story takes us from the silence of the woods to the high-pressure chaos of a 911 dispatch center, where the horror is heard but not seen. This account comes from Christine, a veteran emergency dispatcher with 12 years of experience. She has handled cardiac arrests, domestic violence, and car crashes with a steady hand and a calm voice. But the call she received on August 14, 2022, broke through her professional armor and left scars that haven't healed. The call came in at 11:47 p.m., the dead of night. The voice on the other end was a young man, hyperventilating, his breath hitching in a way that signaled primal, uncontrollable panic. He identified himself as a thru hiker on the Appalachian Trail, currently somewhere in the deep wilderness of the Smoky Mountains. "I'm being followed," he whispered, his voice trembling. "It's the last hiker. It's the last hiker." Christine tried to ground him, using her training to extract information. "Sir, take a breath. Who is following you?" The story spilled out in a terrified rush. He had been hiking toward a shelter, planning to camp for the night. When he arrived at the lean-to, he found a scene that made no sense. The shelter was full of gear, high-end backpacks, sleeping bags unrolled, camp stoves set up, half-eaten meals sitting in bowls, but there were no people. It was a ghost town. He assumed they were collecting firewood or filtering water. He sat down and waited. He waited for an hour, then 2. The sun went down, and the woods went pitch black. Nobody returned. That's when he turned on his flashlight and saw the footprints. The dirt around the shelter was churned up, revealing a mass exodus. Dozens of boot prints, all leading away from the shelter in the exact same direction. It looked like everyone had stood up simultaneously, abandoned their gear, and walked into the dense forest in a trance. He followed the tracks for half a mile. They didn't weave, they walked in a straight military line into the thicket, and then, abruptly, the tracks stopped. They didn't turn around, they didn't scatter. They just ceased, as if the people had been plucked into the sky. Terrified, he ran back to the shelter to grab his pack and flee. That's when he saw the new prints. While he had been gone, investigating the trail, something else had come to the shelter. Fresh, large, barefoot prints circled the tents, weaving between the abandoned gear. The prints walked right up to his backpack, stopped, and then led off into the woods in a different direction. He was being hunted. He grabbed his bag and sprinted onto the trail, plunging into the dark, trying to find cell service. That's when the footsteps started behind him. Click, clack, click, clack. When he stopped to listen, the footsteps stopped. When he ran, they ran. Perfect synchronization. Christine dispatched rangers immediately, triangulating his cell signal, but the mountains were vast. She kept him on the line, her own heart racing as she listened to the crunch of his boots and the terrifying silence of the forest around him. "It's too quiet," he whispered. "The crickets stopped. The wind stopped. Everything is dead." Suddenly, he gasped. "Oh God, there's someone ahead." Christine leaned into her headset. "Sir, is it a ranger?" "No," he whimpered. "It's a hiker. He's standing in the middle of the trail. I can see him in my headlamp." The caller described a figure facing away from him, wearing a red backpack and heavy boots. The figure was motionless. "Sir, call out to him. Ask if he needs help," Christine instructed, hoping for a rational explanation. The caller approached slowly, the phone clutching to his ear. Then the screaming started. It wasn't a scream of surprise, it was a scream of sanity snapping. "He's not standing," the caller shrieked. "He's not standing. Oh my God, look at his feet," Christine shouted for clarification. "What do you mean? What's wrong?" The caller's voice dropped to a sob. "He's floating. He's hanging in the air. His boots are 2 feet off the ground. There's no rope. There's no tree. He's just hovering." The line crackled with static. "It's one of the guys from the shelter. I recognize the pack. He's turning around." The description that followed haunts Christine to this day. The caller described the hovering man slowly rotating in midair, not by moving his body, but as if the air itself was rotating him. His arms were limp at his sides. His eyes were wide open, staring at nothing. He wasn't breathing. And then, the caller whispered, "There are more of them. Look up. They're all up there." The call cut out. The line went dead. Rangers arrived at the GPE's coordinates 3 hours later. They found the caller's phone lying in the middle of the trail, the battery drained. They found his backpack. They found the shelter with the abandoned gear, just as he had described. But they never found the caller, and they never found the other hikers. Extensive searches were conducted for weeks. Cadaver dogs, helicopters, thermal imaging, nothing. Just a forest that keeps its secrets, and a recording of a 911 call that ends with the realization that in some parts of the woods, gravity is just another rule waiting to be broken. If you hike the Appalachian Trail, stay with your group. Don't hike at night. And if you find a shelter full of gear with no people, don't wait for them to come back. Run, because they aren't coming back. They are already floating. "He's looking at me," the voice whispered, trembling with a primal terror that transcended the crackle of the cellular connection, and then silence. The call didn't just drop. It was severed, sliced cleanly from existence, leaving nothing but the hollow, static-filled hiss of dead air that every dispatcher dreads more than the screams. I sat frozen in the sterile, fluorescent-lit dispatch center, the receiver pressed so hard against my ear that cartilage began to ache, my finger hammering the callback button with a desperation that defied protocol. 1 ring. 2 rings. Voicemail. I tried again. Straight to voicemail. The silence on the other end felt heavy, almost pressurized, as if the line wasn't dead but was being held open by something listening, something breathing just below the threshold of audibility. I immediately keyed the radio, my voice tight but controlled, sending the coordinates to the Rangers already patrolling Sector 4. They radioed back instantly, the static of their transmission sounding like tearing paper in the quiet room. They were 15 minutes out from the shelter the hiker had described, 15 minutes that felt like a lifetime when you know someone is being hunted in the dark. I stared at the digital map on my monitors, watching the blinking icon of the patrol unit inch agonizingly slowly across the topography of the Appalachian deep woods, watching and praying until exactly 3 minutes later, the phone shattered the silence. It rang with a shrill violence that made me jump, the sound echoing off the concrete walls like a scream. The caller eyed displayed the same number. Relief washed over me, a cold, frantic wave, and I snatched the handset up before the first ring finished. I demanded, leaning into the microphone, breathless. "What happened? Stay on the line." But the voice that slithered back through the speaker wasn't his. It was a sound that defied biology, a wet, grinding cadence that mimicked the pitch of the previous hiker, but lacked the trembling warmth of human blood and breath. It sounded like wet leaves shifting over gravel, or someone doing an impression of a man who had never actually heard a human speak, only studied the vibrations from a distance. "I am the last hiker," it rasped, the syllables spaced out with mechanical, unnatural precision. The hair on my arms stood up, a primal warning system triggered by the sheer wrongness of the tone. "There are no more hikers," the voice continued, ignoring my questions, devoid of urgency, devoid of fear. "Only me. I am the last." A chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning settled deep in my marrow. "Who is this?" I demanded, my training kicking in, even as my instincts screamed to hang up. "Where is the man who called from this number?" There was a pause, a wet, sucking sound on the other end, and then the voice replied, sounding almost amused in a detached, alien way. "He is with the others now, waiting, walking." The intonation rose and fell in the wrong places, turning statements into questions and threats into lullabies. "Soon I will be the last hiker here too. Then I will move to the next trail, the next hikers. I am always the last. I make sure I am the last." The line went dead again, not with a click, but with a sudden absolute void, as if the device on the other end had been crushed. I sat there, the drone of the dial tone sounding like a flatline, realizing my hands were shaking so badly I couldn't type the log entry. When the Rangers finally breached the tree line and reached the shelter area 17 minutes later, the scene they reported over the radio was far more disturbing than a scene of violence. It was a scene of interruption. They found the shelter exactly as the caller had described in his initial panic. Tents were pitched, taut against the wind. Expensive ultralight gear was scattered across the picnic table. A pot of oatmeal was overturned near the fire pit as if kicked in a hurry, but there were no people, no bodies, no blood. Just the eerie stillness of the deep woods where 5 people should have been laughing, eating, and sleeping. The Rangers, hardened men and women who had seen bear attacks and falls from cliffs, sounded rattled as they radioed in the next discovery. They had found footprints leading away from the camp, not running but walking. A single file line of boot prints heading deep into the dense trail-less brush. They followed the tracks for a quarter mile into the suffocating darkness of the forest until they broke into a clearing, and there, standing like statues in the moonlight, were 6 hikers. They were just standing there. Not huddled together for warmth, not looking for a way out, but separated by a few feet each, facing different directions, staring at absolutely nothing, completely unresponsive. The Rangers shouted, waved flashlights in their faces, shook them by the shoulders, but the hikers remained catatonic, their eyes wide and unblinking, pupils dilated to encompass the entire iris. They had to be physically carried out of the woods, one by one, limp dead weight like mannequins, their limbs pliable but their minds completely absent. They were rushed to the nearest hospital, treated for exposure and dehydration, but the psychological paralysis was total. It took days of IV fluids and psychiatric evaluation before a single one of them could utter a syllable, and when the fog finally lifted, the horror truly set in because they couldn't remember the fear. They couldn't remember the flight. The last thing any of them recalled was zipping up their sleeping bags in the safety of the shelter. They had no memory of getting up, no memory of putting their boots back on, no memory of walking into the woods or the hours they spent standing in the dark, silent clearing. It was as if that time had been surgically excised from their brains. But the man who had called me, the owner of the phone, the voice of the initial panic, was never found. Search and rescue teams, accompanied by cadaver dogs and drones, combed a 20-mile radius for days. They turned over every rock, dragged every creek, and rappelled down every ravine. Nothing. Until the 4th day. A volunteer spotted something colorful flashing in the sunlight high above the trail. They found his backpack. It wasn't hidden in a bush or discarded on the ground. It was hanging from a sturdy oak branch, suspended exactly 8 feet off the forest floor. There were no claw marks on the bark, no scuff marks from climbing boots. It was just there, hanging impossibly high, defying gravity and logic. Inside, they found his phone, the battery completely drained, dead, even though he had stated it was fully charged during our brief connection. Below the tree, the mud told a confusing, terrifying story. They found his boot prints, deeply indented as if he had been carrying a heavy weight. But mingled with his prints were others, dozens of them, all identical, all the same size, the same tread pattern, but impossibly chaotic. They went in every direction, north, south, east, west, and then they all just stopped. In the middle of the soft mud, the tracks simply ceased, as if the people making them had vanished into thin air or been plucked into the sky. No walking away, no fading out, just gone. I listened to the recording of those 2 phone calls hundreds of times in the weeks that followed, sitting alone in the dark of the dispatch room after my shift ended. The department brought in specialists from the FBI, audio engineers who analyze voice patterns for ransom calls and terrorist threats. They confirmed scientifically what my gut had screamed at me in the moment. Voice in that second call was not human. The wave patterns were jagged, symmetrical, in a way that organic vocal cords cannot produce. The intonation didn't match any known regional dialect or accent. It was a composite, a patchwork of sounds stitched together by something that understood the mechanics of speech but not the soul of communication. It was mimicking human speech without understanding the context of fear, empathy, or humanity. And here's the part that keeps me staring at the ceiling at 3000 AM, the part that makes me dread every ring of the phone. I have received 2 more calls since that night, different numbers, different hikers, different sections of the Appalachian Trail hundreds of miles apart, but the pattern is always exactly the same. A terrified hiker calls, whispering that the woods have gone quiet, that their friends have vanished from the campsite, that they are being hunted by something they can't see but can feel. The call cuts off. Dead air. And then, minutes later, the call back. That same, grinding, artificial voice. I am the last hiker. I've tried warning people. I've pushed reports up the chain of command, contacted trail conservancies, even posted anonymously on hiking forums. But what can I actually tell them? That there is an entity roaming the 2,000 miles of the Appalachian Trail that makes hikers disappear. That there is a mimic in the woods that systematically hunts down everyone on a section of the trail until it is alone. That it calls itself the last hiker and moves from shelter to shelter, clearing out humanity like someone erasing chalk from a blackboard. Who would believe it? Even with the digital recordings, even with the missing persons report stacking up, it sounds like a campfire story, a legend to scare tourists. But I know what I heard. I know the texture of that voice. And I know that somewhere on the Appalachian Trail right now, as the sun begins to dip below the ridgeline and the shadows stretch out like grasping fingers, there is a hiker who is about to become the last. There is someone who is about to find themselves inexplicably alone at a campsite where the fire is still warm, but the people are gone. Someone who is about to hear footsteps behind them that match their pace exactly, stopping when they stop, walking when they walk. And I know that when their call comes into my station, or any station along the eastern seaboard, there is nothing I will be able to do to save them. Because you cannot outrun the last hiker. You cannot hide from something that wears the voices of the dead. Once it has chosen you, once you have become aware that you are the only one left, you are already gone. You just don't realize it yet. So if you are planning to hike the Appalachian Trail this season, if you are looking for solitude in the great American wilderness, I have one piece of advice that might save your soul, if not your life. Never, ever let yourself be the last hiker in your group. Do not linger to tie your shoe when others walk ahead. Do not stay behind at a shelter to finish your coffee while your companions hit the trail. And if you ever find yourself alone at a campsite with all the gear still there, tents up, food out, books open, but no people, do not wait to see where they went. Do not call out their names. Just run. Run until your lungs burn and your legs give out, and do not look back. Because the last hiker is always watching, always waiting for the straggler, and once it has you, you will end up just like all the others, standing in a moonlit forest clearing, staring at a void with no memory of how you got there or what you have become. Or worse, you won't end up anywhere at all. You will just be gone, erased from the earth. And the only trace of your existence will be your backpack hanging impossibly high in a tree, swaying in a wind that isn't blowing, and your voice on a 911 call that no one will want to believe is real, repeating words that aren't yours. Those were 10 terrifying accounts from the shadows of the Appalachian Trail. Stories that the Park Service doesn't want to talk about, but stories that you need to hear. Before we fade to black, I need to ask for your help one more time in keeping this channel alive. We are incredibly close to hitting that 1,000 subscriber milestone here on Park Ranger Files, and your subscription is the fuel that keeps us researching, documenting, and exposing these unexplained encounters. If these stories sent a chill down your spine, please hit that subscribe button right now. It takes a second for you, but it means the world to us. And click the notification bell so you never miss an upload when we venture back into the deep woods. I also want to hear your voice in the comments. Have you ever hiked the Appalachian Trail? Have you ever felt that sudden, irrational panic of being watched from the tree line? Do you have a theory about the last hiker or the impossible footprints? Drop your thoughts, your theories, and your own experiences in the comments below. The most chilling stories often come from you, the viewers, and your engagement helps this channel grow against the algorithm. If you have a story, share it. You might just see it featured in our next deep dive. And finally, if you enjoyed this content, please destroy that like button and share this video with anyone who loves the outdoors or anyone who needs a reason to stay inside. This has been Park Ranger Files. Stay safe out there, trust your instincts, and I'll see you in the next video. Until then, remember, some trails are meant to be walked alone, but some should never be walked at all.